This is Bernard Frischer speaking to you today from Bloomington, Indiana, about virtual museums and virtual tourism in the age of the coronavirus pandemic. Let me start by reminding those of you old enough to remember about the cliché one heard over and over again in the early days of virtual reality in the 1990s. Virtual reality is a solution in search of a problem. My talk today has some good news and some bad news. The good news is that virtual reality has finally come up against the problem it is better suited to solve than any other approach of which I am aware. The bad news is that the problem is the pandemic caused by the coronavirus. Almost the entire world is suffering through an unexpected, disruptive pandemic that has upended our economy and way of life. Hundreds of millions of people are sheltering at home. Those going outside are doing so wearing masks and maintaining social distance, and those leaving home are doing so only to work in essential occupations, to shop for food, medicine, or other critical supplies, or to get some exercise in the fresh air. The last thing anyone is doing nowadays is taking a long airplane flight to see a World Heritage Site far from home, or even visiting a museum close to home. This is terrible for tourism, but I will argue that it presents virtual tourism, whether to a museum or to some other destination, an opportunity to become the new normal after we defeat this dread virus. And while the pandemic is raging, it offers hundreds of millions of people the solace, enjoyment, and edification of experiencing the world's great monuments from the comfort of their own homes. We don't yet know how long the pandemic will last, and of course, we fervently pray it will be of short duration and cause the least possible loss of human life. That said, we already know that things won't be changing anytime soon. The consulting firm Tourism Economics thinks it won't be until at least 2023 that our normal way of life returns to the way it was before the pandemic spread across the globe. To be sure, as cities, regions, and countries enter phase 2 of dealing with the pandemic, some travel will resume and some cultural institutions will reopen, but it is predicted that attendance will be greatly reduced. This is in part the result of people's fear of infection, and thus giving a lower priority to non-essential recreational activities, and partly the consequence of the social distancing that will reduce the number of people who can be accommodated on a bus, on an airplane, or in a hotel or museum. Moreover, we should also expect that some people who might wish to visit a heritage site or museum will be priced out of the market for doing so. As social distancing requires airlines to space passengers far apart, the price of flying is inevitably going to rise, and the same can be predicted for other components of the tourist budget, from hotel rooms to meals and to the price of admission for a tour. The fewer people who can be accommodated, the more those using the service will have to pay to defray the costs. This negative impact will doubtless be greatest on those destinations that are the farthest away from where most of their visitors reside and which have the highest population density. Hence, the relative popularity of destinations is likely to change. Places with high population density and far from where most people live, such as London, Paris, and Rome, will move down the scale, and remote places with low populations, such as nature reserves, will rise. Finally, until a vaccine and therapeutic drugs are marketed to stop the disease, many potential travelers, no matter how affluent, will be deterred from leaving home in the first place. They will fear falling ill while abroad, or at a minimum, being stranded for weeks or months far from home if a shelter-in-place order comes into effect where they happen to be traveling. And if that occurs, they may well also be subject to a mandatory quarantine upon returning home. Far safer just to stay put in the first place. The United Nations World Tourism Organization predicts that worldwide tourist arrivals will fall by 60 to 80% in 2020 as compared to 2019. If so, this means that arrivals will be around 500 million in 2020 as opposed to 1.5 billion last year. The economic impact could be enormous indeed. In 2019, tourism accounted for an estimated $3 trillion of the world's GDP. A 60% reduction would translate into a loss of $2 trillion. And as I speak, the situation does look dire. Airlines have grounded 66% of their planes, almost the entire fleet of cruise ships is docked, and millions of workers in the tourist industry have been fired or furloughed. In the United States, for example, the number of people unemployed across this sector is estimated in May 2020 to be 8 million. But much as the coronavirus is having a devastating impact on tourism, it is not yet causing a diminution of our urge to travel, a psychological characteristic that has been identified as a key component of modernism. As Eric Zulo wrote in his recent book on tourism, contemporary humans, at least in the developed world, spend a great deal of their time either traveling or thinking about traveling. This means that as the coronavirus has resulted in shelter-in-place orders from government, it has inevitably caused a pandemic of another, less malign disorder, cabin fever. Wikipedia defines cabin fever as the distressing claustrophobic irritability or restlessness experienced when a person or group is stuck at an isolated location or in confined quarters for an extended period of time. Wikipedia goes on to state that cabin fever is not itself a disease. Escaping the confinement of the indoors and changing one's scenery and surroundings can easily help an individual experiencing cabin fever to overcome their mania. Of course, at the present time, such an escape is not advisable or in some places even legal, at least if it means going on a walk farther than a few hundred meters from your home. So I suggest that for many people, the safest and most practical solution is virtual tourism. This concept encompasses simulated visits to cultural heritage sites like Hadrian's Villa in Tivoli, Italy, and to museums such as the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. Virtual tourism started to develop long before the coronavirus struck. The first efforts to use computer graphics to simulate heritage sites date to the early 1990s and were collected in 1996 in a book edited by Forte and Ciliotti. By the early 2000s, hundreds of sites had been virtualized, and enough experience had been accumulated for the world's experts to band together to publish two complementary best practice guidelines, the London Charter, and a few years later, the Seville Principles. It must be said, however, that despite this progress, virtual tourism never took root economically. It was never able to pay its own way, let alone to become a profitable part of the larger global tourist industry. Instead, it has always been a boutique operation heavily subsidized by grants from governments and philanthropic organizations. Here I would single out the European Union for special notice and praise. It has invested by a factor probably of more than 100 what any other institution has put into the development of virtual tourism. So, looking back over the past 30 years, one can say that virtual tourism has matured in terms of technology and standards, but it has not yet found its rightful place in the world's economic order. If you want a glib answer to the question of why this should be, I would suggest that it is not too far from the truth to state that as recently as last year, it was still accurate to say that virtual reality was still a solution in search of a problem, at least when it came to the specific form of virtual reality that is involved in virtual tourism. What was the problem posed by tourism that could only, or at least be best solved, by virtualizing it? When people could go to a museum or take a trip to a famous cultural heritage site, and when they were doing so each year in their hundreds of millions, why did they need to experience it in their homes or schools on a computer display? Of course, this in no way should be taken to disparage the work by virtual heritage experts in recent decades. It is not uncommon for basic research to take many years or decades or even centuries to find a practical application and widespread commercial adoption. The basic research on electricity, for example, started as early as the 18th century, but the age of electricity, with the commercialization of the research of people like Edison and Tesla, did not begin until the late 19th century. To take another familiar example, computing machines were theorized by Charles Babbage in the 19th century and again in the 1930s by Alan Turing. Functioning computers did not exist before 1941, and the computer business itself did not take off until the 1950s. It may well be that we are finally about to enter what could be called the age of virtual tourism. Just as World War II gave the impetus to take the computer from the realm of basic research to its first implementation, so too the battle against COVID-19 may finally help virtual tourism to transition from digital humanities laboratories and universities to mainstream commerce. But what exactly is virtual tourism, and what are some examples that can give us a preview of the new industry it will soon spawn? To answer these questions, I will put on my hat as president and founder of Flyover Zone, a corporation based in Bloomington, Indiana, whose mission is to use ICT to promote understanding of cultural heritage sites and monuments around the world. Flyover Zone has existed since 2016, and since then has published 5 applications presenting different experiences of ancient Rome. We distribute in the online stores of Apple, Google Play, Microsoft, Oculus, Steam, and most recently, Viveport. We have also published other products on our free website, including notably a large virtual museum of Greek and Roman sculpture. The company is presently at work on 5 new applications that should be published later this year, including Baalbek Reborn and Hadrians Villa Reborn. So Flyover Zone's work can provide many examples to illustrate the points I wish to make in the rest of my talk about virtual tourism and virtual museums. So far, as the next 2 slides suggest, since the coronavirus struck in March, we have received very favorable notice in the media for our products, and we are considered one of the leading companies in the emerging industry of virtual tourism. Virtual tourism is a close relative of virtual reality. Indeed, if we think of a Venn diagram, we can visualize VT, as I will call virtual tourism from now on, as a smaller circle inscribed within the larger circle of virtual reality, or VR. The key characteristics of VR are immersivity, interactivity, and presence. These are 3 ways of looking at what it means to find yourself in a virtual world. You are immersed in it, that is, all sensory input comes from the computer simulation. All sensory stimulation from the real world is, ideally at any rate, blocked. You can interact with the space and objects in the virtual world. Typically, you can move an object, fire a weapon, speak with an avatar or non-playing character. You can move around the space at will. Finally, the result of the immersion and interaction, coupled with the blockage of contact with the real world, creates a sense of presence. You're there in the simulated world and no longer in the real world around you. VT shares all these features with VR with one possible exception. Often the user cannot move around the space in a VT application. Instead, VT offers teleportation from 360 panoramic image to 360 panoramic image. Indeed, the Webopedia defines a virtual tour precisely as, to quote, a collection of panoramic images that are played in sequence. Of course, a panoramic image has no geometry, which means there is no virtual space to move around in, as you might typically do, for example, in a shoot-'em-up video game. This is not a limitation of VT, but I would suggest a virtue, at least for those approaching our applications to use the technology to simulate something real, in this case, an actual tour of a cultural heritage site. For such users, the fact that a virtual tour teleports you from point to point in the vast spaces of a city like Rome or Paris is a great advantage as compared to the experience of real tourism in those places today. On a real tour of those places, tourists in their millions follow tour guides on pre-programmed paths through the city, its museums, and its archaeological sites. Most of the time is spent trekking from one site to another. Think of how guides in the Vatican Museum show you a couple of masterpieces like the Laocoon before making you hike hundreds of yards to the pièce de résistance, the Sistine Chapel. Usually there are so many people crowding in front of these masterpieces that it is hard to get a good glimpse, and certainly the atmosphere does not support quiet contemplation and learning. At any rate, after you've stolen a glance at the Laocoon and gone into the crowded Sistine Chapel, You have to hike all the way back to the exit and get into your bus to be taken across Rome through its notoriously slow traffic to the next stop. Let's say that's the archaeological park of the Colosseum and the Roman Forum. First, you stand in line to get into these sites, then you follow your guides for 100 meters or more to reach the first point of interest. Along the way, you mainly look down at your shoes in order to avoid spraining your ankle as you walk along the very uneven, poorly preserved ancient surface. And I've seen a lot of the people I've taken on tours sprain their ankles, or worse, one had to go to the hospital after throwing out her back. When you arrive at the first point of interest, everyone in your group crowds around the guide who talks and points at the key features of the site. You may or may not hear everything, and you may or may not make out what feature the guide is even pointing to. Your tour is now half over. You spent the overwhelming majority of the time walking or being driven from Site A to Site B to Site C. Arrived at those sites, you perhaps have caught half of the information the guide has attempted to convey, and struggled even to get a view of the main object of interest, assuming you could even figure out what the guide was talking about. Meanwhile, you are looking at the statues and monuments in their current state of preservation, which generally bears little relationship to how they looked in antiquity when new. Now, using the products of Flyover Zone, contrast real tourism with what VT has to offer. First, let me explain the basics of our user interface. Our applications run on smartphones, tablets, laptops, personal computers, and VR headsets. Whatever your device, the content is the same, and so is the user interface. When you launch an application, you start in our tutorial, which typically takes less than a minute and teaches you how to use our interface. And by the way, once you've learned and you come to another application that we publish, you have the option to skip the tutorial and go right to the tour. You are now seeing screen capture of the tutorial. You arrive inside a courtyard furnished with colossal statues of 3 classical gods. You can turn around 360 degrees, and wherever you look, you are immersed in the virtual space, which is actually a panoramic image. We call this space the scene. In front of you is a virtual tablet, like an iPad. You read the text and are prompted to click on the map icon in the upper right-hand area of the tablet. This opens a map of the scene. As you pass your cursor over one of the 3 dots on this particular map, you see the legend below telling you what you will see if you click on that dot. When you click on the dot of your choice, you are teleported to that position in the scene. The content on the tablet changes accordingly. Now you will see what we call the tablet image on the left. Its purpose is to help you recognize in the scene around you the particular point of interest that we discuss. To the right is usually a short text telling you about that feature. If you click on the gear icon in the upper left-hand part of the tablet, you can select your preferred language. We typically support Chinese, English, French, German, and Italian. Well, let's stick with English and go back to the tablet and hit that play button so we can finish up the tutorial. Juno is the Roman equivalent of Greek Hera. She is the wife of Jupiter and hence wears a crown as the queen of the gods. Her attribute is the scepter, indicative of her royal authority. Well, we finished the tutorial. It took less than a minute, and we are now invited by the text on the tablet to proceed to the virtual world. Hello, I'm Bernard Frischer, director of the Hadrians Villa Reborn project. We're visiting a very special place. It is not part of the public archaeological site of Hadrians Villa, but stands on an adjacent private property. Today, it may not look like much, but as you will see, in Hadrian's day, it was a precious gem of art and architecture. If we just snap our fingers, we can use the magic of virtual reality to travel back in time to the year 138 AD and see the place as the ancient visitor did. Wow, quite a difference. So what is this place? Moderns call it the South Theater because it stands at the southern end of the built-up area of the villa. By the way, there was a second theater at the northern end of the villa, about 1.5 kilometers away, and yes, Hadrian's Villa was a very big place. The choice of this app is not accidental. Even though Hadrian's Villa is one of Italy's most visited archaeological sites, the South Theater is seen by no one for the simple reason that it stands on private property. Our company got permission from the owner and was able to get onto the site to gather the information we needed for this app. So here you have another advantage of VT. It can take you to places not accessible to the general public. Another advantage of VT is that it can take you up into the air to get a view of the geographic context when this is desirable. You can see in this particular app that an aerial view is something we offer our users. It is important because it makes them appreciate the siting of the theater and also the fact that, however impressive the theater was, it was just one of over 30 major buildings at the villa and occupies only a tiny fraction of the estate's estimated 75 hectares or 200 or so acres of land. But the main advantage of VT to an archaeological site is that it allows you not only to see the standing ruins, but also reconstruction of how the place appeared in its heyday. In this case, that means during the last years of the life of the Roman Emperor Hadrian in the 130s of our era. In this short video, you see how with our app, the user can easily use the time warp feature to go from today's ruins to the original condition of the round temple that was an important part of the theater. And in digitally restoring the theater, we can not only repair the extensive damage done to the building, we can also bring back all the scattered works of art and other furnishings that are known to have been taken from the site in past centuries. As an example, I draw your attention to the stage building of the theater. You see a backdrop made of a 2-story colonnade decorated with statues. This is not based on fantasy or speculation. In fact, we have a reliable 16th century report that allows us to start tracking down precisely where these statues are today, and we find that many are now in Madrid and perhaps Stockholm. We have digitally recontextualized them here, and at the same time we have digitally restored the statues to put back lost fingers, noses, and especially the polychrome finish. So, in the case of our app presenting the South Theater, I think it is incontrovertible that the digital tour is far superior to an actual tour. First of all, the place is not open to the general public, so you're not likely to have an actual tour. Secondly, even those visiting the site cannot go up into the air to see the geographical context, nor can they go back in time to see how the theater was designed and decorated. And finally, our app offers the commentary of an expert archaeologist explaining everything that the virtual tourist is seeing. Such an expert guide would only rarely be available to the general public. Sometimes we offer a dialogue between two experts or an interview at a certain stop with the world's leading expert about what you see on that part of the tour, for example, the excavator of a monument. None of this is possible, or at least feasible, in real-world tourism. Let me now talk about the state of the economic development of VT. In brief, there's not much to report. As I mentioned earlier, VT is still in its infancy, and most of what is going on pertains properly to basic research, not commercial implementation and deployment. Our company and one or two others make up the entire sector. If you expand your definition of VT, you can include, if you will, 3 important initiatives of Google: Google Arts and Culture, Google Expeditions, and Google Street View. All 3 involve the virtualization of the real world. In the case of the first 2, the parts virtualized fall entirely into the category of cultural heritage. In the case of Street View, only a small percentage represents cultural heritage sites and monuments, but some of them are in Street View. Of those presented, the user receives no ancillary information to help her understand what she is seeing. Street View takes you to some tourist sites, but it leaves you to figure out what you are looking at once you arrive. The same is true of Google Expeditions. It offers very useful interactive 360 panoramic visuals that can enrich education on all levels, but it is up to the instructor to provide the guided tour. Moreover, Expeditions shows you the current condition of the site and never offers time warps taking you back in time to a reconstruction of how it appeared when new. Nevertheless, for all their limitations, Google's 3 initiatives attest that a major corporation thinks that virtual heritage and some form of virtual tourism is a good investment. And this fact offers encouragement to small companies like our own to try to follow the maxim of the great American film producer Samuel Goldwyn, to do less but do better, to do less than Google but to do it better. Better than what? Well, much as I respect Google, I usually have the same reaction to Google Expeditions, Arts and Culture, and Street View that I have to Google Book. They needed to involve the subject experts, not just Google's admittedly world-class engineers. How often have you had the experience I constantly have of doing a Google search, getting a link to one of their ebooks, following the link, and landing on, say, page 283 of some book whose title and author are not provided? To get that rather critical piece of information, you have to scroll to the beginning of the book, which inevitably means that you lose track of where in the book the passage of interest is located. Of course, you could always write down page 283, but there ought to be a better way. And there is, of course. Google's agreements with the scholarly libraries whose books it digitized was that the libraries would own the data and Google would have a license to use them. So the libraries got together and started the Hathi Trust as a common ebook library. Since it was conceived and designed by experts, that is, librarians, it is far superior to use, at least if you are a scholar like me. Now let's come back to Google's 3 VT services. As an example of the typical approach Google takes and what I find wrong with it, let me just use the first app I find when I go to Google Arts and Cultures these days. It is an exploration of the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. You can see it in the video clip which shows my screen capture made earlier this week. You launch the app and are brought into a hall which is not identified. In the middle of the hall, you see some statues. Naturally, your curiosity is aroused and you want to get a closer look at them. So you start by panning around the scene, and occasionally an X appears on the floor. You're probably familiar with this X from Google Street View and know that if you click on it, you will be teleported to a panorama centered on that spot. So, since you want to look at those statues, you now look for X's in front of them, and you quickly find that there aren't any. Of those that are near a statue, many are not in a sensible spot. That is, if you click on the X and try to look at the work of art, you get a strange oblique view, not the one you would naturally gravitate toward if you were in the actual Musée d'Orsay. At any rate, on those rare occasions when an X is intelligently positioned in front of a statue, you naturally want to read something about the statue so you know what you're looking at. Isn't that the main purpose of going to a museum? But the app provides no information at all. You notice that there is a label in the museum on the base of the statues of interest to us, and you hope that Google has had the good sense to place an X near the labels so you can read them. But no such luck. In the end, Google's approach to presenting the art is just as mechanical and clumsy as it took in presenting the books. As we say in billiards to console someone who has missed a complicated shot, good concept, poor execution. Contrast to this our company's approach. There's a long tradition in fields like photography, architecture, city planning, cinema design, and most relevantly, guidebook writing about what is called the best general view. For example, we know from the best practice recommendations of the Society of Motion Picture and Television Engineers that the most comfortable viewing angle for a human is between 0 and 35 degrees. We should not force the viewer to tilt his head more than that for a long period of time, or it becomes painful, uncomfortable. We know that frontality and axiality are normal and desirable in viewing the facades of buildings or works of art. Austrian urban planner Hermann Mertens, way back in 1890, worked out and quantified the best practices for siting buildings and monuments with respect to a viewer. In recent decades, a whole discipline known as environmental psychology has sprung up to tackle the best and worst ways to design spaces that humans will experience. At Flyover, we take into account such work as this and spend a lot of tender, loving care in the choice of the vantage point that we offer our virtual tourists at the various stops in the applications that we publish. As you see, we also offer them a great deal of information about what they are seeing, whether the short description on the virtual tablet or the longer commentary in the audio segment you could hear at each stop on one of our tours. So, to take the Musée d'Orsay, how would we virtualize a museum? Well, you don't have to guess. My lab at Indiana University is well along in a 5-year project to digitize in 3D all the classical sculpture in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. As you can see on our website and in this screen capture of it, we present the information in an organized way, and through the interactive 3D models we have published, we give the user not only the standard frontal and axial view, but any view she may want. Moreover, we make it possible to change the lighting on the sculpture. Finally, we put the label information, or what we call the metadata, right there on the web page, along with the interactive 3D model, so our users can easily find and read it. In other words, on our Uffizi website, we assume that anyone using it is there to understand the works of art and not to gawk at the architecture in which the art is displayed. The latter seems to have been the operating assumption behind Google's treatment of the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. Let me conclude by addressing a question that perhaps many of you are doubtless already asking yourselves. If virtual tourism really takes off as a major industry, what will happen to our traditional cultural heritage institutions? Will anyone still visit them when it is so much easier and so much less expensive just to experience them virtually in their own home or schoolroom? No doubt one can argue the case both ways, in favor of the idea that VT will make a major dent in real tourism, and in support of the contrary thesis that VT will actually serve to increase real tourism. My own firm belief is that, assuming people will resume their old pre-COVID-19 ways and bring the tourist industry back to its 2019 level once this disease is licked, VT will actually increase real tourism. This is because of what Walter Benjamin called the aura of the original work of art. It can never be reproduced, and the experience of being in its presence can never be replaced with a mechanical, or nowadays we would have to say digital, replica. The aura of the artistic masterpiece is powerful and irresistible. It is to the human spirit what magnets are to iron. Speaking personally, I have not been working in this field for over 30 years in order to put museums and archaeological sites out of business. To the contrary, I have always held that my work would make theirs easier to carry out. Think of all the museums on planet Earth. According to the authoritative publication Museums of the World, the count in 2019 was some 55,000. How many of you following this lecture can name more than 500 of them? And when it comes to cultural heritage sites and monuments, the number is countless. At least no one I know of has tried to make a tally. How many people listening today have visited more than 500 places around the world like Rome, Paris, London, Karnak, Athens, Jerusalem, Monte Alban, Palenque, etc., etc., etc.? In my view, VT will raise general awareness about cultural heritage sites and institutions that the overwhelming majority of people alive today have never even heard of, let alone visited. It will arouse curiosity about cultural heritage monuments, and that curiosity will inevitably lead more people to visit them than would otherwise have been the case. Why would you visit something that you didn't even know existed? Only time will tell whether I am being overly optimistic, and I admit that optimism is a habitual character defect of mine. But whether I am right or wrong, I am confident in predicting that the age of virtual tourism is about to dawn, and I would be very surprised and disappointed if we do not see hundreds of companies like mine springing up in the next few years to do business in this new sector of the world economy. And I conclude with the thought that in the meantime, it's very gratifying to us at Flyover Zone to be doing something to mitigate cabin fever and to help people get through this terrible period of sheltering in place. Thank you very much.